Her daughter abandoned her elderly mother with Alzheimer's in the forest and shouted, "You are going to die here. I do not want to take care of you anymore." Days later, when she discovered what had happened to her mother, she broke down in tears of regret. A daughter abandoned her elderly mother with Alzheimer's in the forest and shouted, "You're going to die here. I don't want to take care of you anymore." Days later, when she discovered what happened to her mother, she broke down in tears of regret. The afternoon fell heavily on the small peeling wooden house, where Sarah watched through the dusty window as the last boxes were being loaded into the moving truck that had just departed, leaving behind only the echo of the diesel engine disappearing down the irregular cobblestone street. At 38, her brown hair was disheveled and tied back with an old elastic band, while her green eyes revealed the deep exhaustion of someone who had lost 8 months of sleep trying to find work, sending resumes that were never answered, paying medical bills with money she didn't have. Her calloused hands, marked by years of housework and medical care, held a red envelope with the final eviction notice, while her bare feet stepped on the cold, loose floorboards of the house that would soon no longer be hers. The small, poorly lit room smelled of medicines and disinfectant, with moisture stains on the low ceiling and peeling wallpaper on the walls yellowed by time. Margaret, her 72-year-old mother, was sitting on the torn sofa with faded fabric, staring into emptiness with that lost look that Sarah knew so well, since Alzheimer's had settled like a cruel invader in their lives years ago. "Mum, we need to talk about what's going to happen to us," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady while feeling despair rising in her throat like a suffocating wave. "I don't know what to do anymore. We've lost the house. I have no job and the doctors want more money for your medications." Margaret turned her wrinkled face toward her daughter, her once sweet features now marked by constant confusion and deep wrinkles that seemed to have deepened drastically in recent months. But her faded blue eyes showed no sign of recognition, only growing irritation and fear. The woman who once baked the best pies in the neighborhood, who sang lullabies and told enchanting stories, now couldn't even remember the name of her own daughter, who had sacrificed her entire life to care for her with unwavering devotion. Her hands constantly trembled due to the medications, and her thin body seemed even smaller inside the faded floral dress that Sarah had bought months ago. Sarah approached slowly, carefully stepping on the floorboards that creaked under her feet, extending her hand to touch her mother's bony shoulder, but Margaret violently recoiled, knocking over a glass of water that was on the coffee table and shattered on the floor into dozens of gleaming shards. "Who are you?" shouted Margaret, rising unsteadily from the sofa, her trembling hands spotted with age marks pointing accusingly at Sarah. "Get out of my house. I don't know you. Where are my parents? I want to go home." Sarah's heart broke once more, as happened every day in recent months, as she tried to swallow the tears that insisted on springing up and burning her eyes, already swollen from so much crying. "It's me, Sarah, your daughter. You raised me, loved me, taught me to walk and talk. Please, Mom, try to remember something, anything." The sound of hesitant footsteps in the small front garden, full of weeds and withered flowers that Sarah no longer had time or energy to care for, caught the young woman's attention, who recognized the familiar silhouette of the neighbor peering through the low fence of peeling white-painted wood. She knew that the entire neighborhood was aware of the difficult situation they lived in, of Margaret's night screams that echoed through the silent street, of the ambulances that occasionally needed to be called when her mother had panic attacks or tried to run away from home in the middle of the night. Sarah felt the suffocating weight of the silent judgment of people who whispered behind her back about her inability to control her own mother, about her lack of resources to place Margaret in a specialized clinic, about her unkempt appearance of someone who had given up taking care of herself. The small yard was full of discarded medical waste, empty medicine bottles and hospital equipment that she had tried unsuccessfully to sell. "You don't understand anything," Sarah shouted toward the half-open window, knowing that the neighbor could hear her perfectly through the thin wall separating the houses. "You don't know what it's like to live through this every day, waking up in the middle of the night to screams, changing diapers, bathing someone who treats you like a stranger. You don't know what it's like to spend your last penny on medications and still hear that it's not enough." Margaret, frightened by her daughter's raised voice and the hostile energy filling the small, stuffy room, began pacing back and forth across the narrow living room, bumping into furniture and muttering incomprehensible words while nervously pressing her hands against her chest. "Where is Catherine? I need to find Catherine. She always comes home when it gets dark. My little girl always comes back." The mention of Catherine's name cut through Sarah like a sharp blade dipped in salt, as she knew from fragments of old conversations that her mother was referring to the daughter she had lost decades ago, even before Sarah joined the family through an adoption process she barely understood at the time. Margaret always called for Catherine in moments of greatest confusion and despair, as if her sick mind preferred to live in the painful but familiar past rather than accept the uncertain and frightening present. Sarah had grown up hearing whispers about this sister she never knew, about the deep sadness that had settled in the house after her death, about the silence that followed and was only broken when she herself arrived as an attempt to heal old wounds. But now at 38, and at the height of her own crisis, Sarah felt she would forever be an inadequate substitute, a pale shadow of something her mother had lost forever. Sarah felt her legs weaken when she realized that once again she would be invisible to the woman who had raised her with love and patience. Once again, she would be a stranger in the very house where she had grown up and dreamed of the future. "Mom, Catherine is not here," whispered Sarah, trying to maintain patience that had long since run out, her voice coming out hoarse and broken. "It's me who's here. It's me who takes care of you every day, who bathes you, who feeds you, who stays awake when you have nightmares. It's me who sold everything I had to pay for your treatments." But Margaret didn't hear, or pretended not to hear, continuing to desperately search the dark corners of the room for someone who would never return, moving old curtains and looking behind furniture as if Catherine might be hiding there. "Catherine always comes home. She's a good girl, obedient and loving, not like these strangers who keep coming in here and going through my things." The anger that Sarah had suppressed for months, swallowing daily humiliations and frustrations, finally found a crack to escape, rising from her stomach to her throat like volcanic lava about to explode and destroy everything in its path. She looked around the devastated house, remembering all the possessions she had sold to pay for expensive medications, the family jewelry that went to the pawn shop, the antique furniture that had sentimental value but was transformed into money for medical appointments, the sleepless nights caring for her mother who screamed and cried, the jobs she had lost because of constant medical emergencies, and the need to accompany Margaret to endless consultations. Sarah looked at her own hands, which were once smooth and well cared for, now rough and marked with cuts and bruises from carrying a person who frequently resisted care. In the yard, covered by a torn tarp, was her old 15-year-old car. A worn-out sedan with peeling paint and bald tires, the last possession that remained from a lifetime of hard work and total dedication. "I can't take it anymore," exploded Sarah, slamming her hands on the wooden table with such force that it made the few remaining objects jump and an old picture frame fall to the floor. "You don't know who I am. I sacrificed everything, absolutely everything for you, my youth, my dreams, my chance to have a family of my own, and it means nothing to you. Nothing." Margaret stopped walking and stared at Sarah with eyes wide with genuine fear, as if she were seeing a terrible ghost or a monster suddenly appear to threaten her. "I just want Catherine to come back." "Where is she? Why are these people yelling at me?" The neighbor had moved even closer to the low fence, clearly interested in the drama unfolding in the house next door, and Sarah could feel the curious and judgmental eyes observing her every move through the half-open kitchen window. She knew that her reputation in the neighborhood was already completely ruined, that people saw her as a negligent and incapable daughter who couldn't properly care for her own mother, who whispered in bakeries and markets about her strange behavior and about the screams that came from her house during the early hours. The overwhelming social pressure, combined with the emotional and physical exhaustion that had accumulated for months without rest, created a perfect storm inside Sarah's chest, a feeling of claustrophobia that made her feel as if the walls of the house were closing in on her. The medical bills were piling up on the kitchen table, red reminders of overdue payments, threats of power cuts, notices from the pharmacy about medications that could no longer be provided without advance payment. Sarah looked at Margaret, who continued to mumble about Catherine and strange people, and felt a wave of despair so intense that it made her tremble from head to toe. "Let's go for a drive," Sarah said suddenly, grabbing the rusty keys of the old car and walking toward the door with determined but shaky steps. "I need to get out of here before I completely lose my mind, before I do something terrible." Margaret hesitated for a moment, looking suspiciously at Sarah, but eventually followed her to the car, mumbling quietly about Catherine and about strange people who invaded her house and messed with her personal things. The old car's engine coughed and choked a few times before finally starting, releasing a cloud of dark smoke through the punctured exhaust pipe, and Sarah drove in heavy silence through the familiar streets of the suburb, passing simple houses with small yards, children playing on the sidewalk, and people sitting on porches enjoying the late afternoon. The journey to the forest took about 20 minutes through cracked asphalt roads and dirt paths, and Sarah knew the way by heart because she used to take her mother for walks in that place in the times when Margaret was still lucid and could appreciate nature. The dense forest stretched for several kilometers, with tall ancient trees that formed a green shady ceiling, narrow trails covered with dry leaves, and the constant sound of birds and insects that created a relaxing natural symphony. Sarah remembered happy afternoons walking among the trees with Margaret, collecting wildflowers, watching squirrels and birds, talking about life and making plans for the future. The dusk painted the sky with shades of orange, red and purple, creating long and mysterious shadows between the tall trees that seemed to lean threateningly over the narrow dirt path. Sarah parked the car in a small clearing surrounded by century-old trees, where there was a fallen trunk that served as a natural bench and a partial view of the verdant valley that stretched to the distant horizon. "This was always our special place, remember?" asked Sarah, turning off the engine and turning to face her mother, desperately trying one last time to connect with the woman who seemed to have disappeared forever behind the fog of disease. "You used to bring me here when I was little. You would tell me stories about the forest fairies, about the magical animals that lived among the trees, about how nature healed all kinds of sadness and pain." But Margaret just looked around with growing suspicion and fear, as if she were in completely unknown and hostile territory, her hands gripping the car seat tightly while watching the shadows that danced between the trees with the movement of leaves in the wind. The place that once represented peace and family connection now seemed sinister and threatening through Margaret's confused eyes, who saw danger where there was once beauty and comfort. Sarah got out of the car and walked a few steps toward the center of the clearing, breathing deeply the fresh air perfumed by wildflowers and moist earth, trying to find in nature the strength she could no longer find within herself. The surrounding trees were predominantly ancient oaks and cedars, with thick trunks covered with green moss and branches that intertwined, forming a natural cover that filtered the golden light of dusk. The ground was covered by a thick layer of dry leaves that made noise underfoot, and there were small white and yellow flowers scattered among the undergrowth. Margaret finally got out of the car, but remained close to the open door, as if she were ready to flee at any moment, her eyes nervously scanning each shadow and each movement of the leaves swaying in the wind. "Where are we?" Margaret asked with a trembling voice, pressing her hands against each other. "This place is dangerous and there are monsters in the forest. Catherine told me about the monsters that live here." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes as she realized that even in that special place full of happy memories, her mother could not find peace or recognition. The crushing weight of years of constant care, daily sacrifices and unrequited love finally collapsed upon Sarah like an emotional avalanche impossible to contain or control. She fell to her knees on the damp forest ground, feeling the moisture penetrate through her old torn jeans, sobbing convulsively as words emerged from her mouth like a desperate confession torn from the depths of her agonizing soul. The sound of her sobs echoed among the trees, mixing with the birdsong of those preparing for nightfall, creating a melancholy symphony of human pain and natural indifference. "You don't recognize me anymore," Sarah shouted, beating her hands on the muddy ground and feeling the earth stick under her nails, dirtying her fingers with a mixture of mud and decomposing leaves. "I sacrificed my entire life, my promising career, my relationships, my youth, my chance to be happy, and you don't even know my name. Years taking care of you, and I'm a stranger." Margaret backed away several steps, clearly frightened by her daughter's emotional intensity. Stumbling on exposed roots and fallen branches, and Sarah felt something dark and terrible grow inside her chest like a poisonous plant that had been watered by months of frustration and despair. The surrounding forest seemed to silently witness the destruction of a relationship that had been the center of Sarah's life for decades, the trees remaining motionless and indifferent to the human drama unfolding in their shadow. "I can't anymore. I can't do this anymore," Sarah muttered, slowly rising from the damp earth, her clothes dirty and her hands trembling uncontrollably as she stared at her mother with red eyes swollen from tears of anger and despair. "You'll die here. I don't want to take care of you anymore. I'm sick of being invisible in the life of someone I love more than myself." The terrible words left Sarah's mouth before she could stop them, carried by a destructive force she didn't know existed within her, and the deafening silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind rustling the tree leaves and the distant song of a night bird beginning its melancholy melody. Margaret stood completely still for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, slowly processing what she had heard with her confused and fragmented mind, while Sarah felt the absolute horror of what she had just said, settling into her consciousness like corrosive poison burning every cell in her body. The clearing that was once a haven of peace had transformed into the scene of an irreversible family tragedy, witnessing the final destruction of a love tested beyond its limits. The forest air, previously fragrant and refreshing, now seemed heavy and suffocating, laden with emotional tension hovering between mother and daughter like a toxic cloud. Sarah looked at her earth-stained hands, at her mother's torn dress, at the blue eyes staring at her with pure fear, and realized she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, spoken words that would echo forever in her conscience like a self-imposed curse. Without looking back, without allowing herself to think of the consequences of her act, Sarah ran toward the old car, as if fleeing from a fire she herself had started, leaving Margaret alone in the forest that was quickly darkening with the arrival of the cold and dangerous night. "Catherine," Margaret called, her fragile and frightened voice echoing among the ancient and indifferent trees. "Catherine, where are you? I'm scared. It's getting dark and I don't know where I am." Sarah heard her mother's broken voice calling for Catherine as she started the car engine with violently trembling hands, but didn't have the courage to look in the rearview mirror, knowing that the image of Margaret alone and lost in the forest would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Forgive me, Mother. Forgive me for what I just did. Forgive me for being so weak." The journey back home passed like a distorted blur of constant tears and overwhelming regret, as Sarah drove through deserted streets with hands trembling on the worn steering wheel and eyes burning from so much crying. Each red light was an opportunity for remorse to grow inside her chest like a malignant tumor. Each familiar street a reminder of all the times she had passed there with Margaret by her side, going to medical appointments or simple outings that now seemed like precious moments lost forever. The guilt began to corrode her stomach like concentrated acid even before she reached home, creating a physical pain that mingled with emotional anguish in an almost unbearable way. And she knew she had crossed a moral line that could never be uncrossed, committed an act that would define the rest of her existence. The old car made strange noises during the journey, as if even the machine was protesting against what had happened, and Sarah drove on autopilot through streets she knew by heart, her mind obsessively repeating the last words she had shouted at her mother in the forest. As she turned the corner onto her street, Sarah saw two uniformed figures waiting on her house porch like somber sentinels, and felt the blood freeze in her veins as if winter had suddenly arrived in her body. A middle-aged police officer, with a prominent belly and severe expression, approached the car even before Sarah could completely park, while another remained standing near the front door, observing her every movement with eyes trained to detect guilt and nervousness. The street lamppost partially illuminated the dark uniforms and metal badges that identified the officers, casting threatening shadows over the small, poorly maintained yard. Sarah parked the car with hands trembling so much she could barely remove the key from the ignition, while mentally trying to formulate an explanation for something that had no acceptable explanation. "Ma'am, you need to tell us where your mother is," said the older officer, his voice loaded with unquestionable authority and moral disapproval that cut through the night air like a sharp blade. "Now! Elder abandonment is a serious crime. and we have a very serious complaint against you." The night police station smelled of cold coffee and cheap disinfectant, with fluorescent lights flickering intermittently over walls painted in faded green that had witnessed thousands of confessions, lies, and tears over the years. Sarah was led through narrow corridors filled with informative posters about civil rights and legal procedures, her steps echoing against the cracked linoleum floor while she tried to mentally process the gravity of the situation she had put herself in. The interrogation room was small and claustrophobic, with a scratched metal table, 3 uncomfortable chairs, and a surveillance camera silently blinking in the upper corner, recording every movement and every word spoken in that intimidating space. The older officer sat on the opposite side of the table, opening a folder of documents and preparing a pen to record the statement, while Sarah wiped away tears with the back of her hand and tried to organize thoughts fragmented by guilt and despair. For 45 agonizing minutes, Sarah confessed between uncontrollable sobs every detail of what had happened in the forest, from the argument at home to the terrible moment when she abandoned Margaret alone in the growing darkness. "I know I made a terrible mistake," Sarah murmured, her broken voice echoing off the cold walls of the room. "But I swear I didn't want anything bad to happen to her. I just couldn't bear the pressure anymore." The officer meticulously noted every word of the confession, occasionally asking specific questions about times, exact location of the forest, and Margaret's mental state at the moment of abandonment, creating a detailed dossier that would be crucial for the search operation to be organized in the early hours of the next morning. Sarah provided precise directions to the clearing where she had left her mother, describing natural landmarks such as the fallen trunk that served as a bench, the main trail leading to the location, and the approach via the dirt road that connected the forest to the town. The officer explained that a specialized rescue team would be mobilized at dawn, including search dogs, firefighters trained in search and rescue, and paramedics equipped to handle medical emergencies involving elderly people with Alzheimer's. The operation would involve at least 20 people and would be coordinated by the fire department in partnership with the police, using radio communication equipment, high-powered flashlights, and special stretchers for transporting victims over uneven terrain. Sarah was informed that she would remain temporarily detained until Margaret was found, and that she would be released only after the successful completion of the rescue, remaining in preventive custody to ensure her availability throughout the entire process. "You're lucky that it hadn't gotten completely dark when you left her there," said the police officer, closing the folder with a dry sound. "But if something happens to your mother during the night, the legal consequences will be far more serious than you imagine." The temporary cell where Sarah was housed was a cramped cubicle with dirty white painted concrete walls, an iron bed with a thin mattress, and a small sink with a faucet that constantly dripped, creating a repetitive sound that echoed in the oppressive silence of the early morning. Sarah sat on the edge of the hard bed, hugging her knees against her chest while trying to mentally process everything that had happened in the last few hours, from the moment she exploded in the forest to finding herself locked in that cold and impersonal place. Through the small window with iron bars, she could see the city lights blinking in the distance and occasionally heard the sound of sirens passing through the streets, each one making her heart race with the possibility that it could be related to the search for Margaret. Time seemed to drag on tortuously, each minute transforming into an eternity of guilt and regret, as Sarah imagined horrible scenarios about what could be happening to her mother, lost in the dark and dangerous forest. During the first hours of detention, she alternated between moments of convulsive crying and periods of emotional numbness, where she remained completely still, staring at the damp spots on the low ceiling. A young police officer brought her a cup of lukewarm water and a ham sandwich that she couldn't swallow, explaining that she would need to wait until dawn for news about the search operation. "Try to get some rest," suggested the officer, his voice showing a mixture of professionalism and human compassion. "Tomorrow will be a very long day for all of us, and you'll need energy to deal with everything that is still to come." While Sarah remained in the cell, trying unsuccessfully to find a comfortable position on the narrow, hard bed, bureaucratic procedures followed their course at the police station through official phone calls and consultations of government databases to locate Margaret's close relatives. The computerized system revealed the existence of Patricia, Margaret's younger sister and only living relative registered in official documents, who lived on the other side of the city in a modest apartment in the urban center. Telephone contact was established around 2 o'clock in the morning, when Patricia was informed about the emergency situation involving her sister and asked to come to the police station as quickly as possible to provide information and follow the developments of the case. Simultaneously, the Department of Social Services was notified about the case due to the delicate nature of the situation, involving abandonment of an elderly person with Alzheimer's and possible family negligence, which required the presence of a social worker specialized in geriatric cases. Stephanie, an experienced 42-year-old professional who had been working for 15 years with cases of abuse and neglect against the elderly, was assigned to monitor the development of the situation from the beginning, taking responsibility for assessing the family, social and economic conditions that had led to the abandonment. She arrived at the police station around 3 o'clock in the morning, carrying a voluminous folder with official forms and investigation protocols, prepared to conduct detailed interviews and collect evidence that would be fundamental to determine the appropriate legal measures. "This type of case always involves much more than appears on the surface," Stephanie commented to the duty officer, organizing her documents on an auxiliary table. "We need to fully understand the family dynamics before making any definitive decision about culpability or protective measures." The roar of a powerful engine echoed through the police station yard around 4 o'clock in the morning, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps and high heels clicking against the concrete with theatrical and indignant rhythm. Patricia burst through the double-glass doors of the police station like a human storm, her platinum blonde dyed hair tied in an elaborate bun, wearing a set of dark clothes that seemed to have been chosen specifically for a dramatic occasion, with golden jewelry shining under the fluorescent lights of the entrance hall. At 68 years old, Patricia maintained a carefully cultivated appearance of offended dignity, with heavy makeup applied to perfection even during the early hours, impeccable red nails, and an expensive leather bag that swung on her arm as she dramatically gestured to the officers on duty. She demanded immediate information about Margaret's whereabouts and about the circumstances that had led to her disappearance, speaking in a loud and authoritarian tone that echoed through the silent corridors of the nighttime police station. Several officers approached to try to calm her down and explain the situation, but Patricia constantly interrupted with indignant questions and dramatic statements about the incompetence of the family and authorities responsible for the safety of vulnerable elderly people. When she was finally informed that Sarah was detained and had confessed to the abandonment, Patricia demanded to see her immediately, declaring that she had always suspected inappropriate behavior from her adoptive daughter. "Bring that criminal here right now," exclaimed Patricia, slamming her purse on the reception desk with enough force to make objects jump. "I'll show you exactly what kind of person she really is." Sarah was escorted from the cell to the main area of the police station, where she found Patricia, waiting with an expression of theatrical indignation and moral superiority that made her stomach churn with anxiety and anticipated humiliation. The atmosphere was charged with tension as several people observed the imminent confrontation, including officers on duty, Stephanie with her folder of documents, and some other people waiting for assistance during the early hours. Patricia examined Sarah from head to toe with a look of absolute contempt, noting her wrinkled clothes soiled from the forest, her disheveled hair, her red and swollen eyes from crying so much, and her curved posture of someone carrying the crushing weight of guilt and regret. The initial silence was broken when Patricia pointed an accusing finger at Sarah, her voice loaded with venom and malicious satisfaction for finally having the opportunity to publicly express years of accumulated resentment. The accusation exploded like an emotional bomb in the already tense environment of the police station, where each word was pronounced with deliberate intention to cause maximum psychological and social damage. "I always knew she was a monster," Patricia declared loud enough for everyone at the station to hear clearly. "This girl always wanted my sister's money, and now she has finally shown her true criminal nature." Patricia's public accusation reverberated through the police station environment like a definitive moral sentence, making Sarah physically recoil as if she had been slapped with brutal force, while feeling the heat of humiliation rise up her neck and completely flush her face already marked by fatigue and suffering. Patricia opened her expensive purse and removed an organized folder containing documents, bank statements, and handwritten notes that she had meticulously prepared over the previous months, as if she had been waiting for exactly that moment to present her evidence against Sarah. With theatrical gestures and a voice loaded with false authority, Patricia began to present her version of the facts to the police officers present, alleging that Sarah had systematically diverted Margaret's pension for her own use, neglected essential medical care, and isolated the elderly woman from other family members who could have offered adequate help. The bank statements showed frequent withdrawals from Margaret's account, which Patricia interpreted as evidence of misappropriation, completely ignoring the fact that these withdrawals corresponded exactly to medical expenses, medications, and basic needs of a person with advanced stage dementia. She also presented receipts from pharmacies and medical clinics, arguing that the amounts were excessive and unnecessary, demonstrating complete ignorance about the real costs of Alzheimer's treatment. "Look at these documents," exclaimed Patricia, spreading papers on the table before the impressed police officers. "This criminal has been sucking money from my poor sister for years, and when the money ran out, she decided to get rid of her." Sarah tried to explain between tears that flowed freely down her face, her voice coming out broken and desperate, as she struggled to find words that could convey the truth of her desperate situation and her genuine love for Margaret, despite all the challenges faced during years of intensive care. She talked about sleepless nights when Margaret had agitation crises, about daily baths that became epic battles due to her mother's resistance, about expensive medications that needed to be administered at specific times, about disposable diapers that cost a fortune, about temporary caregivers who were necessary when she needed to go out to look for work or resolve bureaucratic issues. Sarah explained that she had sold all her personal belongings, including family jewelry, antique furniture, appliances, and even clothes, to get enough money to maintain Margaret's care at a minimally decent standard. She described how she had lost several jobs due to constant medical emergencies that required her immediate presence, how she had gone into debt with pharmacies and clinics, how she had resorted to government assistance programs that were insufficient to cover all the needs of a person with dementia. Her words came out hurried and desperate, trying to convey 3 years of sacrifice and dedication that were being distorted and transformed into evidence of criminality by someone who had never participated in the daily care. "I spent everything on medications, diapers, temporary caregivers, special food," Sarah pleaded, extending her hands toward the police officers. "I never took a penny for myself. Every dollar was used to care for her, to keep her comfortable and safe." The tragedy of Sarah's situation became even more evident when she realized that she did not have any documentation that could prove her claims about medical expenses and care provided to Margaret over the previous years. In her daily struggle for survival and her mother's well-being, Sarah had never worried about systematically organizing receipts, invoices, and payment proofs, focusing all her energy on solving the immediate problems that constantly arose. She had sold practically all her personal belongings in quick, informal transactions, often accepting below-market values just to get immediate money for a medical emergency or to buy medications that were running out. Pharmacy receipts accumulated in disorganized drawers and ended up being discarded during forced moves or desperate cleanings when space became scarce. Sarah had not kept payment receipts for temporary caregivers who were informally hired through recommendations from neighbors or acquaintances, nor had she adequately documented expenses for special food, nutritional supplements, and medical equipment she had purchased over the years. Her life had been a constant succession of financial crises resolved in improvised ways, without time or knowledge to maintain the documentation that would now be crucial for her defense. "I don't have proof. I didn't keep the papers," Sarah confessed, her voice fading to almost a whisper. "I was surviving on the edge, solving one problem at a time. I never thought I would need to prove my love for her." The police station environment became even more hostile for Sarah when other officers present began making derogatory comments about caregivers who supposedly exploit vulnerable elderly people, creating an atmosphere of collective moral judgment that completely isolated her from any sympathy or understanding. The officers exchanged meaningful glances among themselves, shaking their heads with disapproval while watching Sarah try to explain her situation without success, clearly influenced by Patricia's theatrical and convincing presentation. Other people present at the station also began to murmur among themselves, creating a chorus of silent judgment that echoed through the walls of the environment, making Sarah feel like a criminal condemned before any formal legal process. A younger police officer, clearly impressed by the version of facts presented by Patricia, made a comment that cut Sarah like a blade. His words revealed a deep prejudice against people who find themselves in desperate situations and are forced to make impossible decisions. The cruel generalization completely ignored the complexity of Sarah's situation and the devastating reality of caring alone for a person with advanced dementia. During this entire process of public humiliation, Stephanie remained in strategic silence, carefully observing every detail of the interaction between Sarah and Patricia, making discreet notes in her folder of official documents about body language, consistency in statements, and signs of emotional manipulation that she could detect in any of the parties involved. For these caregivers are all the same. They exploit the elderly to the last penny, commented the officer, crossing his arms and looking at Sarah with evident contempt. It's always the same story. They pretend love and care, but in the end it's just financial interest. Sarah's situation deteriorated drastically when the chief officer responsible for the case informed her about the potential legal consequences of her actions, explaining in cold, impersonal technical language the different types of criminal charges that could be formulated depending on the state in which Margaret was found by the rescue team. He meticulously detailed the differences between involuntary manslaughter, which would apply if Margaret died, due to negligence or recklessness, and intentional homicide, which would be considered if it was determined that Sarah had deliberate intent to cause her mother's death through abandonment. The officer explained that elder abandonment already constituted a serious crime on its own, punishable by 6 months to 3 years in prison, but that the victim's Alzheimer's and advanced age were aggravating factors that could result in even more severe sentences. He also mentioned the possibility of additional charges related to mistreatment, medical negligence, and embezzlement, especially considering the evidence presented by Patricia about alleged financial misappropriations. Sarah heard every word with growing horror, realizing that her life had transformed into a legal avalanche from which she might never escape, regardless of her original intentions or the genuine love she felt for Margaret. The weight of potential criminal consequences, combined with public humiliation and social isolation, created unbearable psychological pressure that began manifesting through physical symptoms of extreme panic. "I want to make it clear that this is not just a family matter," said the police chief, organizing the documents on his desk. "Depending on what we find in the forest, you could be facing decades in prison." The announcement of possible legal consequences functioned as a trigger that unleashed a severe panic attack in Sarah, who had been containing her emotions through sheer willpower during the previous hours of interrogation and public confrontation. Her body began trembling uncontrollably, starting with her hands and rapidly spreading to arms, legs, and torso, while her breathing became increasingly rapid and shallow, creating a terrible sensation of suffocation despite being in an environment with sufficient air. Sarah felt as if she were being compressed by an invisible force, squeezing her chest and throat, preventing her from breathing properly, while her heart beat so rapidly it seemed about to explode inside her chest. Cold sweat broke out across her entire body, making her clothes stick uncomfortably to her skin, while waves of nausea made her double over herself, seeking relief that didn't come. Her eyes lost focus and began rolling uncontrollably, while her vision became blurred and dotted with bright spots dancing before her dilated pupils filled with absolute terror. Sarah tried to speak, ask for help, explain that she couldn't breathe, but only incomprehensible sounds came from her constricted throat, creating an even more dramatic scene that caught the attention of everyone present at the police station. Stephanie was the first to recognize the symptoms of severe panic attack and immediately requested medical assistance, while trying to calm Sarah with a soft voice and simple instructions for controlled breathing. "She's having a nervous breakdown," exclaimed Stephanie, kneeling beside Sarah and trying to establish eye contact. We need to take her to the hospital immediately before she hurts herself or completely loses consciousness." Sarah's transfer from the police station to the municipal hospital was carried out via an ambulance that had been called by the emergency medical team, while her psychological condition continued deteriorating drastically during the night journey through the empty streets of the city. The paramedics administered oxygen through a facial mask and monitored her vital signs, which showed severe tachycardia, elevated blood pressure, and unstable body temperature due to the extreme stress her organism was facing. Sarah was directly referred to the psychiatric ward of the hospital, a sector specialized in mental health crises that operated 24 hours a day to address emergencies related to anxiety disorders, severe depression, psychotic breaks, and other conditions requiring immediate medical intervention. The psychiatric ward was located on a separate floor from the main hospital, with quieter corridors, softened lighting, and rooms specifically designed to provide a calm and controlled environment for patients in a state of extreme emotional vulnerability. Sarah was evaluated by an on-duty psychiatrist who determined the need for mild sedation to stabilize her condition and allow her nervous system to gradually recover from the psychological trauma suffered during the previous hours. She received an injection of anxiolytic that slowly began to reduce her tremors and normalize her breathing, although her mind remained agitated with obsessive thoughts about Margaret lost in the forest and about the legal consequences she would face regardless of the outcome of the rescue operation. "I'm going to give you something to help you relax," the doctor explained, preparing the medication with precise and professional movements. "Your body needs to rest so we can adequately assess your psychological condition and determine the best treatment." The room in the psychiatric ward where Sarah was placed was small but comfortable, with walls painted in soft shades of light blue, a hospital bed with clean and soft sheets, a reclining armchair for companions, and a window that offered a partial view of the hospital's inner garden, where a few small trees created comforting silhouettes against the night sky. The sedative medication gradually began to take effect, allowing Sarah to finally relax physically, for the first time in many hours, although her mind continued to obsessively process the traumatic events of the night and their possible future consequences. She remained semi-conscious, floating between wakefulness and drowsiness, occasionally hearing the typical sounds of a night hospital: soft footsteps of nurses in the corridors, distant beeps of medical equipment, murmurs of professional conversations, and the constant noise of the ventilation system that kept the air adequately circulating. During the early hours of dawn, Sarah alternated between moments of restless sleep and periods of partial consciousness, where she could vaguely perceive the environment around her, but had no energy to move or speak. Guilt and regret continued to corrode her psyche, even under the effect of medication, creating fragmented nightmares where she saw Margaret lost and frightened in the dark forest, desperately calling for Catherine, while Sarah tried to reach her, but her legs did not obey her brain's commands. "Try to rest now," the nurse murmured, adjusting the sheets around Sarah with maternal care. "You've been through severe trauma, and your body needs time to recover before we can discuss the next steps." It was during one of these periods of semi-consciousness, when Sarah was slowly beginning to emerge from the effects of sedation in the early hours of dawn, that she heard nurses' voices conversing outside her room in low but not completely silent tones. The words reached her in a fragmented way initially, mixing with the residual effects of the medication and creating a sense of unreality, as if she were hearing a conversation through a water filter or a thick wall. Gradually, however, Sarah managed to focus her attention on the female voices, discussing something related to a search and rescue operation, making her heart race again when she realized they were talking about Margaret and the developments of the situation in the forest. One of the nurses seemed to be reporting information she had received through communication with the emergency center, while the other asked specific questions about details of the operation and about the conditions in which the victim had been found. Sarah forced herself to remain completely still and silent, pretending to still be deeply sedated, so she could continue listening to the conversation that might reveal her mother's fate and completely determine the direction her own life would take in the next few hours. The sound of the voices carried an urgency and concern that made Sarah realize something unexpected had happened during the rescue operation, something that significantly complicated the already complex situation. They found the elderly lady alive. "But she's not alone," whispered one of the nurses, her voice laden with evident concern. "There's a child with her, and the situation is very dangerous." The rising sun painted golden stripes through the curtains of the psychiatric ward when Stephanie arrived at the hospital, carrying official documents and a silent determination that had strengthened during the night hours of reflection on the complex case before her. Sarah was partially awake, fighting against the residual effects of sedation, when the social worker entered the room, accompanied by an officer who brought urgent news about the rescue operation that had located Margaret in the early hours of the morning. The information came through radio communication directly from the field command. Margaret was alive, but the situation had become unexpectedly complicated, requiring immediate and specialized intervention that could determine not only the elderly woman's fate, but also Sarah's legal future. The psychiatrist was consulted about the possibility of temporarily releasing Sarah under strict supervision, considering that her presence at the rescue site could be crucial for the success of the operation and for the safety of all people involved. After a quick assessment of risks and benefits, it was determined that Sarah was sufficiently stable to accompany the team, provided she remained under constant custody and remote medical monitoring. "The situation changed drastically overnight," explained Stephanie, helping Sarah get up from the hospital bed. "Your mother has been found, but now there's a child involved, and you may be the only person capable of resolving this peacefully." The journey from the city to the forest entrance was made in an official social services vehicle, with Sarah sitting in the back seat between Stephanie and a security officer, observing through the window the familiar landscape she had traveled the previous night under completely different circumstances. The 30-minute journey allowed Stephanie to explain in detail what had been discovered by the rescue team. Margaret was not alone in the forest, but accompanied by a child who had disappeared from a nearby camp, creating a dual emergency situation that required special care to avoid greater tragedy. Sarah absorbed each piece of information with a mixture of relief at knowing her mother was alive and growing terror as she realized she had indirectly endangered the life of an innocent child, adding more weight to the guilt she already carried as a crushing burden. During the trip, she alternated between moments of cautious hope and waves of anxiety that made her tremble involuntarily, while trying to imagine what it would be like to meet Margaret again after the terrible abandonment of the previous night. The vehicle finally arrived at the forest access point, where a complex operation had been set up during the early hours of the morning, transforming the tranquil entrance of the woods into a military command center with dozens of specialized professionals. "Prepare yourself psychologically," advised Stephanie, observing the pallor on Sarah's face. "What you're going to see won't be easy, but it might be our only chance to save 2 lives." The search command had been established in a wide clearing at the forest entrance, where military tents housed sophisticated communication equipment, detailed maps of the region, and a coordination center that functioned as the brain of the complex operation, involving more than 40 professionals specialized in rescues in difficult terrain. Emergency vehicles were parked in an organized formation, ambulances equipped with mobile intensive care units, fire trucks with climbing and technical rescue equipment, police vehicles with advanced communication systems, and logistical support vehicles loaded with supplies, water, medications, and specialized medical equipment for geriatric and pediatric care. Sarah observed the magnitude of the operation with growing horror as she realized how many people had been mobilized because of her impulsive decision the night before, how many public resources were being used to correct a mistake she had made in a moment of total despair. Dozens of professionals moved with military precision, firefighters checking rappelling equipment, paramedics organizing medications and first aid equipment, police officers coordinating security perimeter, and communication technicians testing radio systems that would maintain constant contact with teams inside the forest. The operation captain, a 50-year-old man with evident experience in complex emergency situations, approached the group as soon as Sarah got out of the vehicle, carrying updated maps and field reports that revealed the gravity of the situation. "We have 2 lives hanging by a thread in there," said the captain, pointing to the markings on the topographic map. "And time is working against us with each passing minute." The captain's technical explanation revealed alarming details about the precise location where Margaret and the child had been found. An area of dense vegetation situated on a steep slope, approximately 2 kilometers into the forest, near a steep ledge that dropped between 2 and 3 meters onto sharp rocks and exposed roots of ancient trees. Margaret was positioned dangerously close to the edge of the precipice, embracing a boy of approximately 8 years old who had been identified as David, son of a couple of campers who had established a temporary camp about 5 kilometers from the main forest entrance the night before. The boy had disappeared from the family campsite during the early hours, probably getting lost while looking for a suitable place for physiological needs, and had wandered through the dark woods until finding Margaret, who was also lost and disoriented since her abandonment. According to observations made by the reconnaissance team through long-range binoculars, Margaret seemed to have adopted David as if he were her own son, demonstrating extreme protective behavior that is characteristic of patients with advanced-stage Alzheimer's when confronted with stressful situations or perceiving children in danger. The dense vegetation around made direct approach difficult, and any sudden movement or excessive noise caused Margaret to retreat further toward the cliff, exponentially increasing the risk of a fatal fall for both. "Margaret is convinced that boy is her son," explained the captain, showing photographs taken with telescopic lenses, "and each approach attempt makes her more paranoid and dangerous." Sarah felt her stomach turn when seeing the photographic images showing Margaret in a deplorable state. Clothes torn and soiled from the night spent in the humid forest, disheveled hair full of leaves and twigs, face marked by small scratches, and an expression of fear she had never seen on her mother's face. David appeared in the photographs as a small and vulnerable figure, visibly frightened and confused, with torn clothes indicating his difficult journey through the dense vegetation during the night. The boy was clearly trying to stay brave, but his tears were visible even through the photographic lenses, and his body posture revealed extreme exhaustion after a night of terror in the dark and unfamiliar forest. Margaret held David with possessive force, whispering inaudible words in his ear, while rocking back and forth in repetitive movement, typical of Alzheimer's patients in severe agitation. Communication attempts through megaphone had been completely fruitless, only increasing Margaret's paranoia and making her retreat closer to the fatal precipice. During the captain's explanation, Sarah could hear desperate voices in the background of the camp and soon identified a middle-aged couple being consoled by Red Cross volunteers, David's parents, who had spent the most terrible night of their lives searching for their missing son. "Your mother doesn't respond to any external stimulus," continued the captain, putting away the photographs. "She has created an alternative reality where she needs to protect that child against the entire world." Tension in the operations command intensified dramatically when David's father, a 40-year-old man with camping clothes still dirty from the fruitless night search, spotted Sarah being escorted by the official team and immediately understood that she was responsible for the situation that placed his son in mortal danger. His bloodshot eyes from a sleepless night fixed on Sarah with pure and uncontrolled hatred, while fighting against the arms of 2 firefighters who were trying to physically restrain him to avoid direct confrontation that could further compromise the delicate operation in progress. David's mother was in a state of emotional shock, sitting in a folding chair wrapped in a thermal blanket, crying silently while holding a small backpack with her son's belongings and a recent photograph that had been used by the search teams during the early morning. The environment around the couple was charged with almost palpable emotional tension, where volunteers and professionals spoke in respectful whispers while trying to offer comfort and psychological support to parents facing the absolute nightmare of any family. Sarah felt the crushing weight of moral responsibility upon realizing that her impulsive decision from the previous night had created a situation where an innocent family was suffering devastating consequences for a mistake she had made. David's father momentarily managed to free himself from the firefighters containing him and advanced towards Sarah with clenched fists and an expression of murderous fury, shouting accusations that echoed throughout the camp and made all activities instantly stop. "If anything happens to my son, there will be legal consequences," roared the father, his voice broken by emotion and exhaustion. "Criminal! How could you abandon a mentally ill person in the forest, knowing there were children camping here?" The multiple approach attempts made by specialized teams during the first hours of the morning had demonstrated the extreme complexity of the situation, where each conventional rescue strategy proved counterproductive and potentially fatal. The firefighter team had attempted a silent approach through the low vegetation, but Margaret detected any movement and responded by dangerously retreating toward the precipice, forcing the team to immediately back away to avoid tragedy. Communication attempts through low-volume megaphones had resulted in even greater agitation from Margaret, who interpreted the unknown voices as direct threats against David and reacted by covering the boy's ears while murmuring reassuring words that couldn't be understood from a distance. An approach by rope and rappel from the opposite side of the ravine had been considered and discarded due to the risk of rock displacement that could cause landslides or excessive noise that would alarm Margaret. Drones equipped with cameras had been used for remote monitoring, but the sound of electric motors caused visible agitation in Margaret, who looked at the sky with growing paranoia and protected David against imaginary threats from the air. The medical team had suggested using tranquilizer darts, but this option was rejected due to the risk of Margaret falling on David or both plummeting from the ravine during the sedation process. Each passing minute increased specialists' concerns about dehydration, hypothermia, and deterioration of medical conditions for both Margaret and David, especially considering both had spent an entire night exposed to the cold and humidity of the forest. "We're dealing with a psychological time bomb," the captain admitted, checking his chronometer. "Any wrong move and we instantly lose both." It was in this moment of total impasse that Stephanie presented a desperate proposal that represented both the last hope for success and the greatest risk of the entire operation. Sarah would be the only person with a remote possibility of establishing emotional connection with Margaret, even if for a few crucial moments, due to the deep family bond that had been built over decades of living together and mutual care. The psychological theory behind the suggestion was based on scientific knowledge about Alzheimer's, where patients in advanced stages often maintain residual emotional memories about significant people in their lives, even when they completely lose the capacity for facial or name recognition. Stephanie explained that Sarah could represent a familiar emotional anchor amid the mental chaos Margaret was facing, potentially allowing a moment of lucidity sufficient for the elderly woman to relax her protective guard over David and allow the rescue team to approach. The risk involved in the strategy was immense. If Margaret rejected Sarah or perceived her as an additional threat, the situation could instantly deteriorate with fatal consequences for everyone involved. Sarah would have to enter the forest alone, equipped only with radio communication, without physical protection beyond a life vest and safety helmet, relying exclusively on her ability to emotionally reconnect with a mother who had been lost in the fog of Alzheimer's. The final decision about implementing this desperate strategy would fall to Sarah, who would simultaneously face the opportunity for personal redemption and the risk of transforming a terrible mistake into an irreversible tragedy. "Sarah, you're the only person she might recognize, even if just for moments," said Stephanie, firmly holding the young woman's shoulders. "You need to try, but understand that you're risking not just your life, but responsibility for 2 deaths if something goes wrong." Sarah accepted the dangerous mission with a mixture of absolute terror and desperate determination, understanding that this was her only opportunity to partially correct the mistake she had made and perhaps save both her mother and an innocent child who had been dragged into her personal tragedy. Preparations for the mission were carried out with military precision. Sarah was equipped with a padded protective vest to minimize injuries in case of a fall, a safety helmet with a front light, a long-range radio communication connected to an almost invisible microphone, and shoes with non-slip soles suitable for irregular and wet terrain. The medical team checked her vital signs and provided basic instructions on first aid, especially focused on techniques to keep a person calm and how to quickly assess the state of consciousness in emergency situations. Detailed instructions were provided by the team of psychologists on communication techniques with Alzheimer's patients in crisis, Use a calm and low voice, avoid sudden movements, validate the patient's reality instead of correcting it, and maintain indirect eye contact to avoid intimidation. The captain of the operation established an emergency protocol where Sarah could request immediate evacuation through a specific radio code, activating a rescue response that would involve direct rappelling and forced removal if necessary. Throughout the preparation process, Sarah could hear David's mother's muffled sobs in the background and his father's whispered prayers, creating additional emotional pressure that made her question whether she would be able to execute the mission without collapsing under the weight of responsibility. "Remember, your mother is lost in the past," instructed the team's psychologist. "You need to enter her reality, not try to bring her back to ours." Sarah's walk through the forest toward the location where Margaret and David were trapped was constantly accompanied by radio communication with the command team, which monitored every step via GPS and offered detailed guidance on navigating the difficult terrain of the dense woodland. The 2-kilometer route took 45 minutes to traverse due to the need for extremely careful movement to avoid noises that might alarm Margaret before Sarah could get close enough to establish visual contact. The forest floor was covered by a thick layer of damp leaves that partially muffled the sounds of footsteps, but Sarah still needed to test each step before completely transferring her body weight, avoiding dry branches that could snap under pressure. The surrounding vegetation was dominated by centuries-old trees with thick trunks covered in moss and epiphytes, creating an environment of green twilight where sun rays sporadically penetrated through the closed canopy of leaves. During the walk, Sarah constantly heard updates through the radio about Margaret and David's condition, who remained in the same dangerous position near the cliff, with Margaret showing increasing signs of agitation and fatigue that worried the medical team. As she approached her destination, Sarah could vaguely hear Margaret's voice murmuring indistinct words, creating a mixture of relief for confirming her mother was alive and anticipated terror about what she would find when she finally spotted her. "You're 50 meters from the target," the command team communicated through the radio. "Reduce speed and prepare for visual contact. And Sarah, remember, you are their last hope." The moment Sarah finally spotted Margaret and David through the undergrowth was surreal. Her mother was sitting on the uneven forest floor, leaning against the trunk of an ancient tree, protectively embracing a clearly terrified boy who was trembling from cold and exhaustion. Margaret seemed to have aged a decade during the night in the forest. Her grey hair was tangled with leaves and small twigs. Her face was marked with scratches and dirt stains. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and her expression revealed deep confusion, mixed with fierce determination to protect the child she believed was her responsibility. David was visibly shaken, with dirty and torn clothes that showed his difficult passage through the vegetation during his nighttime escape, and his small face was marked by tears and dirt. The dangerous cliff was alarmingly close, just 2 meters behind the position where Margaret had chosen to settle, creating a situation where any movement toward the precipice would be potentially fatal. Sarah could clearly hear the words Margaret was murmuring to David, and her heart broke when she realized that her mother was offering the same kind of maternal comfort she had offered to her during childhood, demonstrating that the protective instinct remained intact even when the mind was lost in the fog of Alzheimer's. The scene was simultaneously touching and terrifying, a lost grandmother trying to protect a frightened child, both precariously balancing on the edge between life and death. "Mommy's here, my love," Margaret whispered to David, stroking his hair with trembling hands. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Mommy won't let anything bad happen to you." Sarah approached with deliberately slow and calculated movements, testing each step on the uneven ground, while trying to control her own accelerated breathing and the tears that threatened to obscure her vision in the most crucial moments of the mission. She knew she had only one opportunity to establish a connection with Margaret before her mother panicked and potentially caused the tragedy everyone was trying to prevent. When finally at a distance where she could be clearly seen, Sarah stopped completely and spoke with the softest and calmest voice she could produce, trying to mimic the maternal tone that Margaret used to use when she herself was a child and needed consolation after nightmares or injuries. The moment of recognition was slow and uncertain. Margaret raised her eyes towards Sarah with a confused expression, as if trying to process whether that familiar figure was real or just another hallucination created by a mind fragmented by Alzheimer's and the trauma of the night in the forest. Sarah remained completely still, allowing Margaret to examine her without pressure, while continuing to speak in low, comforting tones that she hoped might penetrate through the mental confusion and reach some residual emotional memory. David also looked in Sarah's direction with an expression of cautious hope, clearly wishing to be rescued, but fearing that any movement might alarm the elderly lady who was protecting him with increasingly desperate strength. "Mother, it's me," Sarah murmured, slowly extending one hand toward Margaret. "I've come to find you, to take you home where you'll be safe and comfortable." The moment of partial recognition happened gradually and in fragments, as if Margaret were trying to fit pieces of an emotional puzzle where some parts had been lost forever. She fixed her eyes on Sarah's face with increasing intensity, her expression alternating between confusion, vague recognition, and a desperate hope that made Sarah realize that some part of the true Margaret still existed, lost within the sick mind. During long seconds that seemed like hours, mother and daughter stared at each other across the physical and emotional distance created by Alzheimer's, while David remained silently between them, intuitively understanding that something important was happening, and that his safety depended on the outcome of that delicate encounter. Margaret uttered a name that made Sarah's heart race dangerously. It wasn't her own name, but the name of Catherine, the lost daughter that Margaret had never been able to completely forget, even after decades of separation through death. Sarah instantly understood that she would have to enter Margaret's altered reality and accept the role of Catherine if she wanted any chance of success in the rescue mission. The decision was made in a fraction of seconds, with Sarah choosing the merciful lie that could save 2 lives instead of the brutal truth that could destroy them. "Catherine, you've returned?" asked Margaret, her voice laden with emotion and disbelief. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she responded, "Yes, Mother. It's me, Catherine. I've come to take you home together." The change in Margaret's behavior after the supposed recognition of Catherine was subtle but significant. Her tense muscles relaxed slightly, her breathing became less agitated, and her facial expression changed from defensive paranoia to cautious relief, although she continued embracing David with protective force. Sarah took advantage of this emotional window to approach a few more steps, always maintaining slow and deliberate movements while continuing to speak in the role of Catherine, inventing comforting memories that could calm Margaret and create the atmosphere of safety necessary for the rescue. She spoke about home, about favorite food, about lullabies that Margaret used to sing, creating an emotional narrative that appealed to deep memories that Alzheimer's had not yet managed to completely erase. David looked between Sarah and Margaret with understandable confusion, but remained quiet and cooperative, demonstrating impressive maturity for an 8-year-old child in a traumatic situation. Sarah extended her hand again, this time managing to get close enough to almost touch Margaret, while gently explaining that they needed to leave the forest because other family members were worried and looking for them. The radio communication remained silent, with the command team anxiously awaiting updates on the progress of the risky mission. "Let's go home, Mother," said Sarah, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. "You and the boy. Let's all go together to where you'll be safe and warm." The disaster happened at the exact moment when Margaret was beginning to lower her guard and consider the possibility of following Sarah out of the forest. The damp and unstable ground beneath their feet, weakened by the previous night's rain and natural erosion near the embankment, began to gradually give way under the combined weight of Margaret and David. The first sign of danger was a dull noise of earth shifting, followed by a sensation of movement that made Margaret look down with an expression of growing horror as she realized that the ground was literally disappearing beneath her. Sarah shouted a desperate warning through the radio while running toward Margaret, but the 2-meter distance was enough for the tragedy to unfold more quickly than any human intervention could prevent. Margaret completely lost her balance when a larger section of the ground gave way, forcing her to release David in an instinctive attempt to prevent both from falling together into the rocky precipice. The sound of impact when Margaret crashed against a rock echoed through the silent forest like a somber echo of all the wrong decisions that had led to that terrible moment. David was thrown to the safe side, falling onto leaves and soft earth. but Margaret plummeted several meters before her body collided with rocks and exposed roots that interrupted her fall. "Grandma, Grandma fell," sobbed David, his words breaking the deadly silence of the forest. "She's not moving." The municipal hospital was immersed in the typical agitation of late afternoon when Sarah arrived escorted by Stephanie and a small medical team that had participated in the forest rescue, their steps echoing through the white and sterilized corridors that smelled of disinfectant and hope mixed with despair. Margaret had been taken directly to the medical observation room in the emergency ward, where a team of specialists in geriatrics and neurology worked to stabilize her condition after the fall down the ravine and prolonged exposure to the cold and humidity of the forest during the previous night. Preliminary examinations revealed mild hypothermia, moderate dehydration, and a contusion that required constant monitoring, although the results of the computerized tomography brought relief by showing no fractures or serious internal damage that could permanently compromise her health already weakened by Alzheimer's. Sarah remained in the corridor during the first hours, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching through the glass window the constant movement of nurses and doctors who entered and left the room where her mother was sedated and connected to monitors that registered each heartbeat and each breath. Guilt continued to corrode her stomach like acid, but now it was mixed with tremendous relief, knowing that Margaret was alive and receiving the appropriate medical care that she herself had not been able to provide during the previous months of financial and emotional struggle. "At least she's safe now," thought Sarah, observing her mother's peaceful face under the white hospital sheets. Perhaps it's the first time in months that she's truly protected and comfortable. David was being examined in a specialized pediatric ward on the other side of the hospital, where doctors specialized in child trauma carefully checked every aspect of his physical and psychological condition after the traumatic experience in the forest, while child psychologists discreetly evaluated his emotional state to determine if therapeutic follow-up. Medical examinations confirmed that David was physically well, with only some superficial abrasions caused by the forest vegetation, nothing that couldn't be treated with simple dressings and routine follow-up in the coming days to ensure there were no complications or infections. His physical and emotional resilience impressed the professionals who attended him, especially considering that an 8-year-old child had spent an entire night in adverse conditions and yet remained relatively calm and cooperative throughout the rescue process. David's parents remained constantly by his side, alternating between moments of explosive gratitude for having their son back safely and periods of contemplative silence where they processed how close they had come to losing the most important person in their lives. Sarah could occasionally hear the family's voices echoing through the hospital corridors, mixing tears of relief with words of gratitude directed to all professionals who had participated in the rescue operation. "He's stronger than we thought," commented the pediatric nurse watching David play with a puzzle. "Children have an impressive capacity to adapt and overcome situations that would leave adults devastated." Sarah was lost in her own tortuous thoughts when she noticed movement at the end of the corridor. David's parents walked toward her with expressions she couldn't fully interpret, making her heart race with fear of more confrontations or accusations that might add weight to the guilt she already carried as a crushing burden. The father, who had shouted furious threats during the rescue operation, now seemed like a completely different person. His shoulders were curved by the emotional weight of the last 24 hours, his red eyes revealed sleepless nights and abundant crying, and his body posture conveyed a complex mixture of exhaustion, gratitude, and shame for his previous reactions. David's mother walked beside her husband, with fresh tears silently streaming down her face, carrying an expression of pure emotion that made Sarah mentally prepare herself for any kind of reaction, from forgiveness to a new avalanche of justified accusations. When they finally reached the chair where Sarah was waiting, there was a moment of heavy silence, where all words seemed inadequate to express the emotional complexity of the situation they had shared. David's mother was the first to break the silence, her words coming out between controlled sobs that revealed the depth of her gratitude and the intensity of the relief she felt for having her son back safely. "Thank you. Thank you for saving my son," she said, surprising Sarah by wrapping her in a tight and sincere hug. "You risked your own life to bring him back to us. I don't know how we will ever repay that." David's father remained standing for a few seconds after the emotional hug between his wife and Sarah, clearly struggling with conflicting emotions that included genuine gratitude mixed with deep shame for the cruel words he had pronounced during the most desperate moments of the rescue operation. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to find adequate words to express regret for having judged Sarah so harshly in a situation where she herself was suffering consequences of decisions made in a moment of total desperation. Sarah observed his facial expressions rapidly changing between guilt, gratitude, and recognition of the moral complexity of the entire situation, realizing that he was genuinely struggling to reconcile his initial anger with the reality that Sarah had saved his son by risking her own life. The environment around them continued to move with typical hospital activity. Nurses passing with equipment, doctors discussing cases in low tones, families waiting for news about loved ones, and the constant sound of monitors and ventilation systems that created a symphony of life and hope. When he finally managed to organize his thoughts and emotions, David's father spoke with a voice broken by emotion, his words carrying sincerity that deeply touched Sarah's already wounded heart. I shouldn't have said those things," he admitted, avoiding direct eye contact out of shame. "I'm sorry. I was desperate and afraid, but that doesn't justify being cruel to you when you were going through hell." The most touching moment of reconciliation happened when David appeared in the corridor, walking slowly toward the group of adults with a shy smile that illuminated his small face, still marked by the experience in the forest, carrying a drawing he had made during the time he spent in the pediatric ward while being examined by the doctors. Sarah felt fresh tears spring to her eyes when she saw the child she had indirectly put in danger, but who now walked freely and safely through the hospital corridors, demonstrating a resilience and capacity for recovery that inspired admiration and hope. David stopped directly in front of Sarah, looking at her with a seriousness that seemed beyond his 8 years of age, as if he wanted to convey something important that he had processed during the traumatic hours they had shared in the forest. His following words cut straight to Sarah's heart, revealing a pure childlike perspective that managed to see kindness and protection where adults saw only confusion and danger. The drawing he carried showed two figures under trees, an older woman protecting a smaller child, with colorful hearts floating around them as symbols of love and care. "Grandma covered me with her coat when it was cold," said David, extending the drawing to Sarah. "She saved me. She stayed with me all night and didn't let me be afraid of the dark." David's innocent words hit Sarah like a devastating revelation about the true nature of her mother, even lost in the fog of Alzheimer's. Margaret had found a frightened and lost child in the forest, and despite her own mental confusion and physical vulnerability, had chosen to protect him with an instinctive maternal love that transcended any cognitive limitation. Sarah realized that while she had abandoned her mother in a moment of despair, Margaret had found strength to care for and protect an unknown child, offering comfort, warmth, and security during a terrible night that could have ended in tragedy. The irony of the situation was both painful and illuminating. The woman whom Sarah had judged as an impossible burden to carry had demonstrated a heroic capacity to place another person's needs above her own fear and confusion. David's family immediately formalized the withdrawal of any accusations against Sarah, publicly expressing their gratitude and recognition that she had risked her own life to save their son, transforming a situation that could have resulted in complex legal proceedings into a demonstration of forgiveness and humanity. Sarah carefully embraced David, feeling the moral responsibility to forever protect the positive memory the child had of Margaret, regardless of any judgment she herself might make about the circumstances that led to the encounter between them. "Your grandma has a very big heart," whispered Sarah, stroking David's hair. "She protected you because that's what good people do. They take care of those who need help." The atmosphere of reconciliation and gratitude was brutally interrupted when Patricia appeared in the hospital corridor like a human storm, marching with fierce determination toward the group gathered around Sarah. Accompanied by a man in a dark suit who carried an expensive leather briefcase and had the typical appearance of an attorney experienced in family disputes and inheritance matters. Patricia had dressed for the occasion in formal black clothes that seemed more appropriate for a funeral than for a hospital visit, and her facial expression conveyed malicious satisfaction at finally having the opportunity to confront Sarah at a moment of maximum vulnerability. The lawyer accompanying her remained silent but alert, carefully observing each person present and making mental notes that would likely be used in future legal proceedings related to Margaret's custody and the distribution of any existing family assets. Sarah felt her stomach turn as she realized that Patricia had interpreted Margaret's hospitalization as the perfect opportunity to advance plans she had probably been developing for months or years, just waiting for the appropriate moment to attack. The presence of David's family and Stephanie offered some social protection against the most extreme accusations, but Sarah knew that Patricia was capable of creating dramatic public scenes that could humiliate her regardless of who was watching. "Sarah is negligent and dangerous," Patricia declared loudly enough for other patients and visitors to clearly hear. "Margaret needs to be permanently removed from her and placed under proper care of real family." Stephanie tried to intervene diplomatically, positioning herself between Patricia and Sarah, while explaining that she was conducting an official investigation into the circumstances of the case and that any decision about future custody or care would be made through appropriate legal processes that would consider all relevant factors, including the history of care provided by Sarah during previous years. The social worker maintained a professional and calm tone, but Sarah could perceive growing tension in her body posture when Patricia began making increasingly aggressive and inflammatory statements about family competence and blood rights. Patricia completely rejected any attempt at mediation or rational discussion, raising her voice and gesturing dramatically while proclaiming her moral and legal superiority over Sarah in terms that revealed deep prejudice against adoption and non-biological family. Other patients and visitors in the corridor began to stop and observe the confrontation, creating an involuntary audience for what was becoming a public scene of family humiliation. The situation was rapidly escalating to levels that could result in hospital security intervention when Patricia pronounced words that cut Sarah more deeply than any criminal accusation could have done. "I am blood family," shouted Patricia, pointing an accusing finger at Sarah. "I have more right than this, this strange woman who appeared in our family when she had nowhere else to go." The tension in the hallway had reached almost unbearable levels when a calm, authoritative voice intervened in the heated discussion, causing everyone present to turn simultaneously toward an elderly, gray-haired man walking toward the group with a medical folder in his hands and a serious expression that commanded immediate respect. Dr. Miller was a 68-year-old physician who had specialized in geriatrics and neurology during 4 decades of medical career, dedicated exclusively to the care of elderly patients with dementia and Alzheimer's, and had followed Margaret since her initial diagnosis 2 years ago, developing intimate knowledge of her medical condition and family history. His presence brought immediate relief to Sarah, who recognized in him a respected authority figure who could offer professional medical perspective on the complex situation that was developing around Margaret's custody and future care. Dr. Miller cordially greeted everyone present, but directed special attention to Sarah, indicating that he needed to speak with her in private about medical issues related to Margaret's treatment that required confidential discussion. Patricia tried to interfere, claiming that as the closest sister, she should be present in any discussion about Margaret's medical condition, but was politely informed by the doctor that medical confidentiality issues required that he speak first with the person who had been responsible for the patient's daily care during previous years. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about some aspects of your mother's medical history," said Dr. Miller, gesturing toward a private consultation room. "There is important information you need to know to fully understand the situation we find ourselves in." The medical consultation room was small but comfortable, with walls painted in soft shades of beige, 2 upholstered armchairs arranged to facilitate intimate conversation, a simple desk with few organized documents, and framed medical diplomas attesting to Dr. Miller's decades of experience and specialization in geriatric care. Sarah sat in the offered armchair, trying to control her growing anxiety about what the doctor might reveal about Margaret's condition or about aspects of her treatment that she completely unknown to her. Dr. Miller carefully organized some documents on the desk before sitting in the opposite armchair, his facial expression showing seriousness mixed with compassion for someone who was about to receive devastating information about family history. He explained that he had discovered documents filed in Margaret's medical record that contained information about traumatic events from the past that had never been shared with Sarah, and that he considered it essential that she know the complete truth before making any decisions about future care or legal issues related to custody. The silence in the room was heavy with anticipation, as Sarah awaited revelations that she intuited would fundamentally change her understanding of her own identity and of the motivations behind decades of dedicated care she had provided to Margaret. "Sarah, there's something you need to know about your family," Dr. Miller began, removing an old folder of documents from the medical file. "I found information in your mother's historical records that I believe has never been shared with you." Dr. Miller's initial revelation hit Sarah like an emotional earthquake that shook the foundations of everything she believed about the true story behind Catherine's death. Margaret had carried guilt for years, believing she was responsible for her daughter's death by not recognizing the symptoms of pneumonia in time to save her. The information came through old medical documents that had been archived for decades and were only rediscovered when Dr. Miller conducted detailed research on Margaret's family history after her Alzheimer's diagnosis 2 years earlier. Sarah vaguely knew about Catherine's existence through fragments of family conversations and episodes where Margaret called her by that name during crises, but had never understood the traumatic circumstances of the death nor the depth of maternal guilt that had shaped Margaret's entire subsequent life. Dr. Miller explained devastating details contained in the medical records. Catherine had died of pneumonia after a medical battle lasting several weeks, and Margaret had obsessively blamed herself for believing she could have saved her daughter if she had taken her to the hospital sooner. The discovery explained much about Margaret's behavior during Alzheimer's episodes, when she frequently confused Sarah with Catherine and demonstrated extreme levels of maternal protection that now made sense in the context of unresolved trauma. Sarah felt as if she was finally understanding the deep roots of the pain she occasionally saw in her mother's eyes, especially when Margaret looked at her with an inexplicable sadness that now gained painful context. "I knew Catherine existed, but I never knew how she died," whispered Sarah, her voice trembling. "I never imagined my mother carried this terrible guilt, that she blamed herself for Catherine's death all these years." Dr. Miller continued his explanation, with details that revealed the emotional trauma Margaret had carried in silence for decades, hiding the pain of losing Catherine even while offering complete love and care for Sarah during years of growth and development. He explained that when Margaret was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 2 years ago, she had taken advantage of the initial period of relative lucidity to share the complete story with him, expressing concern about what would happen to Sarah when she completely lost the capacity for communication and self-care. During these conversations, Margaret had revealed that she never told Sarah about Catherine because she wanted to protect her from carrying the weight of being a replacement child, and because she wanted Sarah to feel completely loved and accepted as a legitimate daughter without shadows from the past. The decision to keep the secret had been made together with other family members at the time of adoption, based on the belief that it would be better for Sarah to grow up without knowledge of the trauma that had preceded her arrival in the family. Dr. Miller showed a handwritten letter that Margaret had written and left in her medical files as a protocol for Alzheimer's cases, where patients often write messages to be discovered later when they lose the ability to communicate. The letter revealed the love Margaret felt for Sarah, but also the crushing weight of guilt she carried about Catherine's death. "Your adoptive parents hid this from you to protect you," explained Dr. Miller, showing old documents. "But when Margaret received the Alzheimer's diagnosis, she told me everything in the initial stages, when she still had enough lucidity to express her concerns." Margaret's handwritten letter was written in shaky but legible handwriting, revealing intimate thoughts and deep emotions that she had kept secret during decades of apparently normal and happy family life. Sarah held the paper with trembling hands as she read words that her mother had written during a moment of lucidity, knowing that she would eventually lose the ability to communicate these essential truths about family history and motivations behind decades of maternal love and care. The letter described the overwhelming guilt Margaret felt about Catherine's death. "I will never forgive myself for failing to save my Catherine. She had pneumonia, and I didn't notice the signs in time. When I finally took her to the hospital, it was already too late to save her." Subsequent paragraphs revealed how this guilt had shaped every aspect of her life during the following 36 years, influencing decisions about Sarah's adoption and about the intensity of maternal protection she offered. Margaret wrote about sleepless nights, questioning if she could have done something different, about obsessive medical consultations whenever Sarah showed any symptoms of illness, about constant fear that tragedy could repeat itself with the second daughter. The letter also revealed the depth of love Margaret felt for Sarah, emphasizing that she had never considered Sarah as a replacement for Catherine, but as a separate and independent blessing who had brought new light to a life devastated by loss. Sarah read each word multiple times, absorbing revelations that recontextualized childhood memories where she had perceived Margaret's overprotection as normal love, without understanding the underlying trauma that motivated each excessive care. "I lived 36 years with this guilt consuming my heart," Sarah read in the letter. "Catherine was my light, and when I lost that light, I thought I would never be able to love again." Dr. Miller waited patiently while Sarah emotionally processed the revelations contained in the letter, observing tears silently streaming down her face as she reread specific sections that revealed the depth of love and guilt Margaret had carried for decades. When Sarah finally looked up from the documents, Dr. Miller continued with additional information that added even more complexity to the family situation. Margaret had written multiple letters during the initial period after her Alzheimer's diagnosis, meticulously preparing for the moment when she would lose her ability to communicate and leaving detailed instructions about medical care, treatment preferences. These letters were filed as standard medical protocol for patients with dementia, allowing doctors and family members to understand the patient's wishes and feelings when direct communication was no longer possible. Sarah realized that Margaret had spent months preparing for the gradual loss of her own identity, writing messages of love and practical instructions that demonstrated exceptional lucidity about the progression of her disease and about the impact it would have on Sarah's life. The revelation added an additional layer of emotional complexity to the guilt Sarah already felt about the abandonment in the forest. Margaret had carefully prepared to protect Sarah even after losing mental capacity, but Sarah had reacted to the stress of the situation by abandoning the very person who had dedicated her entire life to protecting her. Margaret wrote several letters when she was diagnosed, explained Dr. Miller, organizing additional documents. She was methodically preparing for when she would lose her memory, wanting to ensure you knew how much you were loved. The intimate conversation between Sarah and Dr. Miller was abruptly interrupted when Patricia burst through the consultation room door without permission, followed by her lawyer, who carried a voluminous folder of legal documents they had obviously prepared in advance for exactly this type of family confrontation. Patricia had completely lost any pretense of courtesy or respect for medical privacy, determined to present her own revelations that she believed would definitively destroy any claim Sarah might have over Margaret's care or any family inheritance. Dr. Miller diplomatically protested against the invasion of medical privacy, but Patricia completely ignored him, positioning herself directly in front of Sarah with an expression of malicious triumph that revealed satisfaction for finally having the opportunity to emotionally devastate the person she considered a family intruder. The lawyer remained silent but alert, clearly prepared to document any reaction from Sarah that could later be used in legal proceedings related to mental capacity or suitability to care for vulnerable elderly. The atmosphere in the room became charged with hostile tension as Patricia prepared to launch emotional bombs she had kept for years, waiting for the perfect moment for maximum psychological impact. "Since we're revealing family truths," declared Patricia with a voice loaded with venom and malicious satisfaction, "it's time for Sarah to know exactly what her place is in this family and what she really deserves. Sarah, you may have been raised as a daughter, but you were never more than a substitute for Catherine," continued Patricia, savoring each word as if it were a sharp weapon. And I have here a will that Margaret made, leaving everything to me, the house, the pension, everything. You have no right to anything. In fact, you owe me money for the time you poorly cared for my sister." Psychological for Sarah, who remained seated in the cold and dimly lit corridor, leaning against the white tile wall that reflected the flickering fluorescent light from the ceiling, creating distorted shadows that seemed to dance around her figure, curved by emotional and physical exhaustion. She had not been able to sleep even for a few minutes, her mind obsessively spinning around the devastating revelations about Catherine, about the maternal guilt that Margaret had carried for decades, and especially about Patricia's cruel words that had planted poisonous seeds of doubt about her own worth and place in the family. During the long hours of dawn, Sarah alternated between periods of silent crying and moments of emotional numbness, where she remained completely still, staring fixedly at the linoleum floor without really seeing anything, lost in thoughts that repeated like a scratched record, playing the same painful melody over and over. Patricia's words constantly echoed in her mind, never more than a substitute, creating a destructive internal narrative that questioned every memory of maternal love she had experienced throughout all this time of life. Nurses and doctors occasionally passed through the corridor, some offering coffee or words of comfort, but Sarah barely registered their presence, completely absorbed in her deep existential crisis. Was I just a replacement? She asked herself repeatedly, her inner voice laden with pain and uncertainty. A desperate attempt to erase the pain of losing Catherine. Did Margaret really love me, or was I just an emotional remedy for a wound that never healed? Stephanie arrived at the hospital in the early hours of the morning, carrying fresh coffee and an air of professional determination that immediately caught Sarah's attention, still lost in her self-destructive thoughts about identity and family belonging. The social worker had spent part of the night reviewing case documents and researching legal procedures related to wills and family disputes, developing growing suspicions about the legitimacy of Patricia's claims and possible financial motivations behind her accusations against Sarah. Stephanie carefully observed Sarah's deteriorated emotional state, red and swollen eyes from crying, hunched body posture indicating total defeat, hands slightly trembling due to a combination of exhaustion and anxiety, and a facial expression that revealed someone who had completely lost confidence in her own life narrative. As a professional experienced in complex family cases, Stephanie immediately recognized signs of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse that frequently accompany disputes over inheritance and custody of vulnerable elderly people. She sat next to Sarah in the uncomfortable plastic chair, offering hot coffee and compassionate human presence that contrasted drastically with the hostility Sarah had faced in the last 24 hours. "Sarah, this whole story doesn't seem right to me," said Stephanie, carefully observing the young woman's reactions. "Patricia is hiding something important, and I need to help you discover the truth before it's too late." Stephanie's proposal to actively investigate Patricia's allegations emerged as a ray of hope amid the emotional darkness that had engulfed Sarah during the night of insomnia and destructive self-questioning. Stephanie explained that her professional experience in similar cases had developed sharp instincts for detecting document fraud and family manipulation, and that various aspects of Patricia's behavior raised suspicions that required deeper investigation. The social worker had noticed temporal inconsistencies in Patricia's claims about the alleged will, especially considering that Margaret had been under Sarah's care for years without any previous mention of changes in testamentary dispositions. Stephanie also questioned the temporal convenience of Patricia's appearance exactly at the moment when Margaret was most vulnerable and unable to defend herself or communicate her true intentions regarding financial and family matters. The strategy proposed by Stephanie was simple, but potentially revealing. Return to Margaret's old house to look for documents, correspondence, financial records, or any evidence that could contradict Patricia's claims, and establish the truth about Margaret's real intentions regarding Sarah and inheritance issues. Sarah initially hesitated, fearing to discover evidence that could confirm her worst suspicions about being merely an inadequate substitute for Catherine, but Stephanie insisted that the truth, regardless of how painful it might be, would be preferable to the torturous uncertainty that was destroying her mental health. "Does Margaret's old house still exist?" asked Stephanie, taking out a pen and notepad from her professional bag. "We need to look for documents and real evidence before Patricia manages to legally manipulate the situation in her favor." The journey to Margaret's old house was made in Stephanie's official car, a modest but comfortable sedan that offered Sarah the first sensation of security and protection she had experienced since the beginning of the entire family crisis. During the 40-minute journey through familiar neighborhoods that Sarah had known since childhood, Stephanie maintained careful conversation, focused on helping Sarah emotionally process the recent revelations about Catherine and about the maternal guilt that Margaret had silently carried for decades. The social worker explained psychological concepts about unresolved trauma and how parents who lose children often develop patterns of overprotection with subsequent children, not because they love less, but because they fear losing again what they deeply value. I'll translate the text to English while maintaining the original formatting and style. Sarah gradually began to see Margaret's behavior through a different perspective. Excessive care during childhood illnesses, multiple checks during nights when Sarah had a cold insistence on accompanying medical appointments, even when Sarah was already an independent adult, all gaining new meaning when understood as manifestations of love, intensified. Margaret's house was located in an older residential neighborhood where mature trees created refreshing shadows over cracked asphalt streets and modest houses with small gardens that revealed loving care from previous decades. "Do you have the keys?" asked Stephanie, parking in front of the property that seemed abandoned for months. "Because if we're going to find the truth about your family, it will be here among the memories and documents that Margaret kept throughout a lifetime." Margaret's old house remained exactly as Sarah remembered visiting it during childhood and adolescence. A modest two-story building with exposed brick facade, windows with white-painted wooden frames that now peeled due to lack of maintenance, and a small front garden where roses that Margaret cultivated with care now grew wildly without pruning or regular care. Sarah removed from her purse an old golden metal key that she had kept sentimentally even after Margaret moved to live with her, never imagining that someday she would return to the house under such dramatic and emotionally charged circumstances. The front door creaked heavily as it opened, revealing an interior that smelled intensely of mold, dampness, and years of abandonment, with furniture covered by white sheets that looked like silent ghosts of a family life that had flourished between those walls for decades. The air was heavy and dusty, making both Sarah and Stephanie cough slightly as they adjusted to the atmosphere loaded with memories and neglect. Sun rays penetrated through closed curtains, creating beams of golden light filled with dust particles dancing in the still air, giving the house an almost magical atmosphere of a place where time had completely stopped. Sarah walked slowly through the living room, touching familiar furniture covered with dust, the armchair where Margaret used to knit during winter nights, the coffee table where they did puzzles together, the shelves full of books that Margaret loved and that now remained closed and forgotten. "Let's start with the attic," suggested Sarah, pointing to the narrow staircase that led to the second floor. Margaret always kept important documents up there, said it was the safest place in the house against moisture and curious people. The climb to the attic was like a journey through decades of family history, with each wooden stairstep creaking under their feet and creating echoes that reverberated through the silent house, like whispers of old memories waiting to be rediscovered. The attic was a spacious but low room, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roofline, and a small round window that allowed enough natural light to illuminate dozens of cardboard boxes, methodically organized along the walls. Sarah immediately recognized Margaret's organizational system. Each box was labeled with careful lettering, indicating content and time period, revealing a meticulous mind that had carefully preserved documents, photographs, and memories of a lifetime. The labels ranged from medical documents, 80s, to family photos, Sarah as child, and important correspondence, various decades, creating an impressive personal archive that promised to reveal truths long buried under layers of time and family silence. Stephanie systematically began opening boxes related to legal and financial documents, while Sarah naturally gravitated toward those labeled with her own name, feeling a mixture of anticipation and terror about what she might discover about Margaret's perceptions regarding her adoption and place in the family. The attic air was even more charged than the rest of the house, creating an atmosphere of a forgotten sanctuary where family secrets patiently waited to be revealed. "Here are decades of your family history," murmured Stephanie, opening a box full of carefully organized documents. "If there are hidden truths about you and Margaret, we'll find them here among these preserved memories." The discovery of Catherine's photographs was like finding puzzle pieces that Sarah didn't even know were missing in her understanding of family history. Dozens of color and black and white photos showing a girl with dark, curly hair, sweet and mischievous smile, bright eyes that radiated childish joy and innocence that had been prematurely interrupted by death. Sarah held each photograph with reverence, carefully studying Catherine's features, looking for physical similarities that might explain why Margaret occasionally confused them during Alzheimer's episodes. The photos revealed a vibrant and happy child, Catherine playing in the garden, Catherine embraced by Margaret in moments of maternal tenderness, Catherine blowing out birthday candles with an expression of pure happiness, Catherine dressed for school with an impeccable uniform and backpack. Each image told a story of deep family love that had been brutally interrupted, and Sarah began to understand the magnitude of the loss that Margaret had suffered and silently carried for subsequent decades. Even more revealing were the photographs showing Margaret before and after Catherine's loss. Earlier images revealed a radiant and confident woman, while later photos showed deep sadness in the eyes that Sarah had occasionally noticed during her own childhood, but had never fully understood. "Catherine was beautiful," whispered Sarah, carefully arranging the photographs on the dusty attic floor. "Now I understand why Margaret sometimes looked at me with that nostalgic expression. It wasn't because I reminded her of Catherine, but because she missed having two daughters to love." Margaret's diaries constituted an even more revealing emotional treasure than the photographs. Leather-bound notebooks with time-yellowed pages, written in careful calligraphy that documented intimate thoughts, fears, hopes, and mostly the evolution of her feelings regarding Catherine's loss and Sarah's subsequent adoption. Sarah opened the first notebook with trembling hands, finding pages dated immediately after Catherine's death that revealed pain expressed through emotion-torn words. "I've lost my light, my reason for living. Catherine was everything to me, and now there is only darkness where there once was laughter and joy. I don't know how to continue existing in a world where my girl no longer exists." The following pages documented weeks and months of deep depression, where Margaret questioned the purpose of continuing to live, expressed obsessive guilt about medical signs she had supposedly neglected, and struggled against suicidal thoughts that were only overcome through intervention from concerned family members and eventual professional therapy. Sarah read every word with tears silently streaming down her face, finally understanding the depth of trauma that Margaret had faced and somehow overcome sufficiently to eventually open her heart again to love another child. The transition in the diaries was gradual but evident, pages of despair slowly giving way to records about the healing process, about the decision to consider adoption, and finally about the first meeting with Sarah at the orphanage. "Today I met a little 3-year-old girl at the orphanage," Sarah read through tears. "She looked at me with those big, curious eyes, and my broken heart felt something new. Perhaps hope." The subsequent pages of the diaries revealed Margaret's emotional evolution during the first months and years after Sarah's adoption, documenting fears, joys, guilt, and finally growing love that defied any notion that Sarah had merely been a substitute for Catherine. Margaret wrote extensively about Sarah's unique personality, about her intellectual curiosity, about the moment when Sarah first called her mother, about the pride she felt watching Sarah grow and develop into an intelligent and caring child. Most significantly, Margaret directly addressed her own fears about replacing Catherine. "Sarah doesn't replace Catherine. They are completely different souls, and my heart has room to love both. Catherine taught me about maternal love in its purest form. Sarah is teaching me that love can heal and grow stronger after a devastating loss." Year after year, records showed the deepening bond between Margaret and Sarah, celebrations of academic achievements, concern during childhood illnesses, pride during graduation, and countless small moments of daily life that demonstrated authentic maternal devotion. Sarah was particularly moved by an entry written during Sarah's adolescence. Sarah is my daughter, as real as Catherine was. I love them in different ways, but equally deeply. Catherine will always be my first baby, but Sarah is my miracle, proof that the heart can love again after being completely broken. As decades of records continued, Margaret's gratitude towards Sarah became increasingly evident, especially during periods when Margaret needed care and support. Sarah gave me a second chance to be a mother, Margaret had written just a few years earlier. Every day I am grateful that this incredible woman chose to care for me when I needed her most. Stephanie's discovery of the financial documents provided crucial evidence that completely overturned Patricia's allegations about Sarah's supposed financial exploitation of Margaret. Organized folders containing bank statements, cancelled checks, medical receipts, and detailed records showing systematic withdrawals from Margaret's account that corresponded. The records showed that Sarah had been meticulously honest about financial management, often using her own limited resources to supplement Margaret's insufficient pension when medical costs exceeded available funds. Most damaging to Patricia's credibility were recently discovered bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals that coincided exactly with Patricia's periodic visits to Margaret during the past 2 years. Withdrawals that Margaret, due to her advanced Alzheimer's, would not have been able to authorize or even remember. "Sarah, look at this," said Stephanie, spreading bank statements across the dusty attic floor. These statements show that Patricia was systematically stealing from Margaret's account for years, taking advantage of her sister's deteriorating mental condition to line her own pockets. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia had been projecting her own financial crimes onto Sarah while simultaneously positioning herself to inherit everything through falsified testamentary documents. Even more crucial was Stephanie's discovery of Margaret's authentic will, filed with the local registry 10 years earlier, when Margaret was still completely lucid and legally competent. The document clearly stated that everything should be left to my beloved daughter Sarah, who brought joy back into my life after devastating loss. "The will that Patricia showed yesterday is completely fraudulent," concluded Stephanie, comparing dates and signatures. "This authentic document proves that Margaret always intended to leave everything to you, and Patricia has been planning this theft for years." The most emotional discovery was the sealed envelope that Sarah found buried deep within a box labeled, "For Sarah, Important Documents." An envelope addressed in Margaret's careful handwriting saying, "For my daughter Sarah, open when I no longer remember who I am." Sarah's hands trembled violently as she carefully opened the envelope that Margaret had prepared during the early stages of her Alzheimer's diagnosis, when she still possessed enough lucidity to organize her thoughts and express her deepest feelings about Sarah and their relationship. The letter inside was written in Margaret's distinctive handwriting, although slightly less steady than earlier diary records, indicating that the disease was already beginning to affect her motor control, even while her emotional clarity remained intact. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I've lost myself in the fog of forgetfulness," began the letter that would fundamentally reframe Sarah's understanding of her place within the family. "But I want you to know, before my mind abandons me completely, that you were the greatest blessing of my life after losing Catherine." The letter continued with detailed explanations about Catherine's death, about Margaret's subsequent depression, about the decision to adopt, and most importantly, about how Sarah had not only healed Margaret's broken heart, but had expanded her capacity to love beyond what she had ever imagined possible. "So you were not a replacement for Catherine," Margaret had written with obvious deliberation and emphasis. "You were a miracle, proof that even after a loss, the heart can open again and love even more deeply." Margaret specifically described how Sarah's personality, intelligence, kindness, and devotion had enriched her life in ways that were completely distinct from her relationship with Catherine, emphasizing that both daughters occupied unique and irreplaceable places in her heart. "Catherine taught me about maternal love. You taught me about love that heals and transforms pain into gratitude." The last section of the letter was the most emotionally overwhelming, as Margaret directly addressed her fears about how Alzheimer's would affect their relationship and her desperate desire to ensure that Sarah understood her love even when communication became impossible. "If someday I forget your name, your face, your voice, know that my heart will always recognize you," Margaret had written with words that seemed to leap from the page and permanently incorporate themselves into Sarah's wounded heart. You are my daughter in all the ways that matter, not because blood connects us, but because choice, love, and decades of shared life have united us more deeply than genetics ever could. Margaret also addressed her guilt about hiding Catherine's existence during Sarah's childhood, explaining that the decision had been made to protect Sarah from feeling like a replacement instead of a unique individual deserving of unconditional love. Most powerful was Margaret's final request, which hit Sarah like a lightning bolt of recognition. If someday I become lost, please find me. Don't leave me alone as I left Catherine when she needed me. I love you, my daughter. Always. Sarah completely broke down reading these final words, sobbing convulsively as she realized that her abandonment in the forest had fulfilled exactly Margaret's greatest fear, being left alone when she needed love and protection more than ever. Stephanie immediately embraced Sarah, understanding that the discovery of this letter represented both vindication of Sarah's value within the family and the realization of how deeply she had betrayed Margaret's trust during her moment of greatest need. You need to go back to her, whispered Stephanie, holding Sarah firmly. Now that you know the truth about how much she loves you, you need to return that love when she needs it most. The race back to the hospital was marked by growing urgency and a feeling of redemption that Sarah finally allowed herself to feel after hours of emotional torture about her identity and value within the family. Stephanie drove with focused determination while Sarah held the authentic will and Margaret's letter, physical evidence that her mother's love had been genuine and unconditional during decades of relationship together. During the journey, Sarah experienced a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing herself as an inadequate substitute for Catherine, she began to understand herself as Margaret's miracle, living proof that hearts can heal and love can multiply instead of diminish when shared among multiple people. The letter had revealed that Margaret's overprotective behavior during Sarah's childhood had origins not in comparison with Catherine, but in terror of losing another beloved daughter, making each medical concern and safety precaution an expression of love intensified by previous trauma, rather than evidence of inadequacy or substitution. Sarah also finally understood Margaret's occasional expressions of sadness during happy family moments, not because Sarah reminded her of what she had lost, but because she felt grateful for having the opportunity to love two daughters, despite being able to embrace only one. As they approached the hospital, Sarah felt a transformation within herself. From a person questioning her right to exist within the family to a daughter finally understanding the love that had surrounded her all her life. The hospital came into view just as the afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the building, where Margaret was recovering from her own traumatic experience in the forest. I'm ready to face her now, Sarah told Stephanie as they ran through the hospital entrance, ready to tell her that I understand now how much she loves me and how much I love her in return. They found the hospital corridors in a state of controlled chaos, with doctors and nurses moving quickly toward the wing where Margaret was being treated, their urgent steps echoing through corridors that suddenly seemed charged with the energy of a medical emergency that made Sarah's heart race with renewed fear about Margaret's condition. Dr. Miller appeared running toward them, carrying medical charts and wearing an expression of grave concern that immediately indicated that Margaret's medical situation had deteriorated significantly during their absence. Without stopping to acknowledge their arrival, he shouted urgent information that transformed Sarah's emotional meeting into a life-or-death medical crisis. Margaret had awakened from sedation during Sarah's absence and had immediately begun experiencing severe agitation related to her Alzheimer's condition, repeatedly calling for Catherine while attempting to remove medical equipment that was monitoring her vital signs. Her psychological distress was creating physical symptoms that threatened to trigger a stroke or cardiac arrest, and the medical team was struggling to calm her sufficiently to prevent serious medical complications. Dr. Miller's next words hit Sarah with the full force of their implications. Margaret was calling for Catherine, not Sarah, indicating that her mental state had regressed to a period before Sarah's adoption, leaving her trapped in the time when Catherine was still alive and Margaret was desperate to locate her missing daughter. Your mother woke from sedation in a state of severe agitation, shouted Dr. Miller, gesturing urgently toward Margaret's room. "She's disoriented, repeatedly calling for Catherine, ripping out the equipment. The agitation is dangerously elevating her blood pressure, risk of stroke or heart attack. You need to calm her now or we'll lose her." Sarah burst into Margaret's room like a force of nature, finding her mother sitting in the hospital bed in a state of extreme agitation, desperately pulling at the wires of the cardiac monitors, while her blue eyes scanned the environment with pure terror, searching for someone who existed only in her fragmented memories. The alarming beeps of the medical equipment created a chaotic symphony of emergency, while nurses futilely tried to calm Margaret, who resisted any touch or approach as if being attacked by hostile strangers. "Catherine! Catherine! Where are you?" Margaret screamed, her hoarse voice cutting through the tense air of the room like a blade of pure desperation. "I need to find my girl. She's lost and cold." Sarah approached the bed slowly, completely ignoring the monitors showing dangerously elevated blood pressure and irregular heartbeats, focusing only on Margaret's terrified eyes that showed no recognition. With a soft voice that trembled with contained emotion, Sarah made the bravest decision of her life. She would enter Margaret's reality, accepting being Catherine to offer the peace her mother desperately needed. The weight of the discoveries in the abandoned house still echoed in her heart. The letters of unconditional love, the diaries revealing decades of gratitude, the truth about never having been just a replacement. "Mom." "It's me," Sarah whispered, extending her hands with deliberately slow movements. "Catherine has come home." Margaret instantly stopped struggling, her eyes fixing on Sarah's face with an intensity that cut like glass. "Catherine? My Catherine?" she asked with a broken voice, tears beginning to stream down her wrinkled cheeks. "You're alive, I thought. I thought I had lost you forever." Sarah gently held Margaret's trembling hands, feeling her mother's cold and fragile skin between her fingers, remembering every word of the final letter. "If I get lost, find me, please. I'm here, Mum. I'm fine. And you don't need to carry this guilt anymore." "I failed you," sobbed Margaret, clutching Sarah's hands as if she might disappear at any moment. "I didn't see you were sick, didn't protect you when you needed me. I'm a terrible mother." Sarah felt tears burning her own eyes as she witnessed the raw pain Margaret had carried for decades, finally understanding that every overprotective gesture during her childhood had been born from this unresolved trauma. "No, Mum, you didn't fail. You did everything you could. You were the best mother a daughter could have." The medical monitors gradually began to show stabilization as Margaret relaxed in Sarah's arms, her breathing becoming more regular and her blood pressure dropping to safe levels. Dr. Miller watched from the door with tears in his eyes, witnessing a miracle of love that transcended the limitations of medicine. "Forgive me, Catherine," Margaret murmured, her voice fading to almost a whisper. "Forgive me for not being able to save you." Sarah hugged Margaret firmly, feeling her mother's small and fragile body trembling against her chest. "I forgive you, Mum, completely. And you need to forgive yourself too." Margaret moved slightly away to look into Sarah's eyes, and for a miraculous moment, seemed to see beyond the confusion of Alzheimer's. "Sarah," she whispered, and Sarah felt her heart race as she noticed a glimpse of recognition. "My daughter Sarah, have you come to find me?" Without hesitation, Sarah nodded, tears flowing freely. "Yes, Mother, I've come to get you, and I'll never leave you alone again." The garden of the specialized residence was bathed in golden afternoon light when Sarah arrived for her daily visit, carrying a bouquet of white daisies that had become a tradition between them. Margaret was sitting on her favorite bench, watching the flowers gently swaying in the breeze, her grey hair now carefully combed and her serene face showing the peace she had finally found after decades of guilt and suffering. The residence had become a refuge not just for Margaret, but for dozens of other families facing the same challenges that Sarah knew so well. "Hi, Mum," said Sarah, sitting next to Margaret and offering the flowers. "I brought your favorites." Margaret turned to Sarah with a sweet smile, although her eyes showed no recognition. "How kind of you, dear. You have a kind heart." Sarah smiled without sadness, just pure love. "I learned from the best teacher." Stephanie appeared walking through the garden, carrying reports on new cases the center was welcoming. She had become not just Sarah's professional partner, but a true friend who shared the mission of helping caregivers in burnout situations. "How is she today?" asked Stephanie, observing Margaret with affection. "Peaceful and happy," Sarah replied, "exactly how she deserves to be." As the sun slowly set on the horizon, Sarah held Margaret's hand and began to softly sing the same lullaby her mother had sung to her during childhood. Margaret closed her eyes peacefully, a smile touching her lips. "What a beautiful voice," she murmured. "It reminds me of someone very special." Sarah gently squeezed her mother's hand, looking at the nearby sign that read, "Catherine and Sarah Residence, Care with Love," the center she had created, with part of the inheritance to help other families facing the challenges of Alzheimer's. Patricia had been arrested 3 months earlier for document fraud and embezzlement, while Sarah was acquitted of all charges after evidence proved she had been a victim of family manipulation during years of dedicated care. Finally, there was peace and justice for both of Margaret's daughters. "I found you, Mum," whispered Sarah as Margaret peacefully fell asleep beside her. "And I'll never leave you again." Did you enjoy Sarah and Margaret's story? Then subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.